Taylor, thank you so much for joining me on the You're Not Alone podcast. I'm so excited to have you on. I was just word vomiting when we jumped onto the Zoom because I had a chance to start really digging into your background, both professionally and personally, and learning a little bit about the book that you published on Amazon, which we talked about, the Perfectionism workbook, that I think has probably helped a tremendous amount of people, and anybody who listens to this episode, I think will definitely get some value from the book and your expertise. But for my audience, could you go ahead and give yourself, give them a quick introduction on yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And I am equally excited to be here. I think just the title of your podcast alone says a lot. I think in the work I do, it's so important for people to know that whatever they're experiencing, chances are there are dozens, if not thousands, or maybe even millions of people around the world struggling with something similar. So along those lines, my experience is that I've been practicing as a therapist for 17 years at this point. I've worked with a variety of populations over the years, including young adults and adolescents struggling with substance abuse, people struggling with eating disorder behaviors. But really for the last 13 to 14 years, I've really been focused on effective treatment for people living with OCD. And alongside that, any kind of perfectionistic tendencies and what we would call maladaptive or unhelpful perfectionistic behaviors. So I really kind of saw in the work I've done providing direct counseling to people over the years that it's an incredibly common problem that is often overlooked. And when we're talking about things like OCD and some other anxiety disorders, they're often misdiagnosed. And unfortunately, people aren't getting effective help for it. Which is a shame, because there is actually highly, highly effective treatment for OCD, anxiety, and perfectionism.
So, and I appreciate you saying that. And one thing that I had written down, because I was just so curious as I started to learn that one of your, something that you really specialize in was the perfectionistic tendencies. Is perfectionism, is it different from OCD? Is it part of the spectrum of OCD? Can you, as somebody who lives with OCD, I know I understand the intrusive thoughts and obsessions and compulsions, but how does perfectionism play into that? And is perfectionism a diagnosable brain disorder?
Oh, excellent question. I'm glad you asked that one. To answer the last question first, no, perfectionism itself is not a diagnosable disorder. What we see is people with or without a diagnosis of OCD, which is a diagnosable neuropsychiatric disorder. People with or without OCD kind of falling into perfectionistic beliefs, and along with that, some really unhealthy and unhelpful behavioral patterns. So I often say this. You can very well have a lot of perfectionistic tendencies without a diagnosis of OCD. However, people who do meet criteria for obsessive compulsive disorder are far more likely to experience perfectionistic tendencies than somebody without that diagnosis.
And of course, I have other questions, but now I have to ask, why do you think that tendency exists for some people with OCD to exhibit those tendencies of perfectionistic behavior?
Yeah, well, we wish we had a set answer for that. The honest answer is we don't entirely know. A common question I often get is, where does OCD itself come from? Why do people have it or develop it? And the honest answer there is we don't fully know. The prevailing opinion is that there is usually some sort of genetic predisposition to developing OCD and or perfectionistic tendencies, meaning somewhere further down the line in the family, there was a parent, a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, whatever it may be, struggling with something along the lines of anxiety, depression, or maybe even substance abuse. I think the reason we see people with OCD displaying more perfectionistic beliefs and behaviors is because of the nature of OCD itself. And I know I'm probably not telling you anything you don't know from your own experience, right? But OCD is categorized by excessive doubt, right? Just
Right.
people experience these intrusive, unwanted thoughts, images, sensations, urges, whatever it may be. It just creates a lot of doubt. And then the compulsions, the rituals that people are engaging in are designed to kind of eradicate that doubt and the discomfort that comes along with it. So in essence, this is really oversimplifying OCD, and I don't want to do that. But a lot of compulsions are aimed at gaining a sense of certainty, right? It's
Absolutely.
the doubt and uncertainty that often go hand in hand with obsessive obsessions themselves that create that urge for compulsions to have a sense of certainty, have a sense of control, and maybe get some relief from all that discomfort that goes along with the obsessions. And then we hear people with OCD describing as they're going through compulsive processes, trying to achieve a certain feeling. I need to keep doing this thing until it feels perfect or until it feels just right.
Right. Yeah.
Or I have to keep trying to think about things in my own mind in a certain way until it feels safe, just right, or perfect. So it's kind of that sense that things have to be or should be a certain way that often translates to someone with OCD experiencing other kind of perfectionistic behaviors.
So how do you define perfectionism then, through the context of your work and the clients that you work with?
Yeah, so when we're looking at perfectionism kind of in a clinical context, if you will, I do think it qualifies as a clinical issue that needs to be treated, even though it's not a diagnosable condition.
Yeah.
Perfectionism in a clinical context is someone holding themselves to a set of standards that are really unattainable.
Okay.
And because people kind of form these beliefs that things in their life have to meet a certain standard all the time, but those standards they've set initially are unrealistic and many times just completely impossible, that fuels a lot of behaviors that are ultimately unsatisfying and usually lead to increased stress and burnout.
Definitely. And when I was sort of thumbing through the introduction to your book, as you know, I bought it and I can't wait to work through it. But as I was reading through the introduction, there were some thoughts, because there's a survey for everybody listening that sort of helps you dial in your perfectionism score. And I landed on a 25. I'm not sure what the total amount of points you can score, if you will, but there were some statements on there where I was a 3 or a 4, which a 3 is like a lot or often, and then a 4 is like all the time or something like that.
Yeah.
And mine, I have them highlighted here, which was I should be doing more. I have to work hard all the time. And no matter how much I do, it's never enough. Now, for me, that it's really centered around entrepreneurship, because I know it's centered around a belief system that I have, which is that as an entrepreneur, when you're carving out your own path, you have to put in the work. Yep. Like it's not sort of like clocking into that 9 to, and nothing wrong with 9 to 5s for everybody listening, but like, it's not like clocking into that 9 to 5 where, there's a CEO who's driving initiatives, then you've got the C-suite, then you've got middle management, and then maybe you're somewhere in the mix there. You're not making the big decisions. Again, nothing wrong with that. You're serving a function or a role inside of the organization. But as a solopreneur, I guess, if you want to use that term, I noticed that those were some of the phrases that I tell myself over and over again, and they don't feel good. It doesn't motivate me or make me feel good. If anything, it sort of drains me of my energy. So with what you just shared in mind, with unattainable, unrealistic expectations, these standards, how did you, because I know you have a story with this, how did you first learn that you were struggling with perfectionism? How did it sort of rear its head or shine a light on you personally?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that, because first of all, I think it's important for people to know, like, I kind of realized I was a perfectionist, I'd say like late college. So I was about 22, right? And
perfect age. Yeah.
that's a lot of time where, young adults either wrapping up college if they've been fortunate enough to go through college, or, kind of uh, striking out on their own in the business world, or, trying to have their first job, whatever is, that's where they really start to notice these tendencies and behaviors really rear their ugly head, and can start to recognize that they're causing more interference and more distress than it like you just said, it doesn't feel good. It's not motivating. It's not encouraging or fulfilling. And more than anything else, it's that feeling that goes along with it that kind of, kind of defines perfectionism. Point being, I have a form of perfectionism that often goes overlooked.
Okay.
So it took me a little while to figure out that's what was going on for me. So I think when we think of perfectionists, there's probably an unfortunate stereotype that goes along with it. People with perfectionism are often labeled workaholics. They're often categorized as, type A personalities. Often, quite frankly, like the straight A students, people who are graduating summa cum laude, right, at the top of their class, the best athlete on each team, like you name it, right? They are usually the top performers. And all that carries like almost like this positive sense to it. When, in the meantime, to your earlier point, people are actually really unhappy the whole time, right?
Yeah.
So that's the most common stereotype with perfectionism. And I had friends I saw exhibiting those kinds of behaviors. And through some college psychology courses and through my own counseling at that age, I could see they were operating in a way that they were holding themselves to these unrealistic goals. And ultimately, it was causing them a lot of stress. I wasn't doing that.
Yeah.
But what I learned, and this was through my own counseling and therapy as a young adult, what I learned was I was so invested in the outcome of things and having that outcome be quote unquote perfect.
Yes.
I was doing a lot of avoidance and a lot of procrastination.
Yeah.
So this is kind of the quote unquote flip side of perfectionism that a lot of people don't recognize occurring in other people or occurring in themselves. So for myself, and I'm very open about this, through my college experience, I almost never got an assignment done on time. I didn't have the best grades.
Mm-hmm.
But what I learned, it was because I always wanted the A+++. And I knew once I started, I'll just use writing a term paper as an example. Once I sat down to really start researching and working on that term paper, I already knew ahead of time that process was going to be miserable. I was going to be stressed to the max. I was going to be really unhappy. And I would almost, and this would happen, I would get into this feverish pace where I would not allow myself to stop working because it did not feel like the final product was going to be perfect. So instead of putting myself through that misery, I would just try and avoid things and or put them off as long as possible. And then there was kind of this quote unquote benefit to me doing that. I would procrastinate things till the last possible second, maybe get it done at the last second. And then when I didn't get that A+++, I could fall back on the BS excuse. Well, I didn't have enough time. I didn't have enough time to really do it the way I thought it should have been done.
Yeah.
So we see this occur, at all stages in life. Academics is probably the easiest example, but it can occur, as you enter the workforce, right? Like putting off things you've been tasked with at work, not showing up to work on days, literally avoiding your own job because you're so scared, or you at least have some trepidation around the process of what it would take for you to try and achieve that quote unquote perfect outcome.
So to a certain extent, the word that like comes to mind for me is like there's this form of attachment to the desired outcome, and until you, I'm assuming through and I have some of this written down, cognitive behavioral therapy, MBCT, ERP, etc. And I want to dive into that here in a bit. Different ways of thinking about the outcome or the desired direction that you want to take your life, or it's a project, it's a homework assignment, it's a midterm, it's a promotion at work, it's something that you're doing at your job, whatever it might be, until you start to change your relationship with the way that you look at it and the attachment that you have to that outcome, you're always going to stay stuck. But here's something that comes to mind for me. Does the feeling of perfectionism feel safe? And that almost, I don't know if you notice this for yourself, like if you let go of that desire for perfection on a midterm, an exam, whatever it might be, did it feel scary to let go of that? I have to get an A+++ on this exam or nothing at all. Was there a component of that?
Definitely. Right.
Okay.
And this is kind of the trap of perfectionism, and it kind of parallels a lot of obsessive compulsive cycles with OCD as well. And I'll try and explain that. So the trap of perfectionism is this idea, which is really an illusion, that when I get that A+++, when I get that 110 out of 100 on a test, I will finally feel good about myself. I will finally be confident. And then I'll be more comfortable. So all of that kind of translates to a sense of safety and comfort.
Yes.
But the trap is with perfectionism, even if you get that feeling is temporary. I did it. I got the best grade in the class. The professor acknowledged it in front of everybody. Right? Yeah. Mom and dad are so proud, right? But guess what? There's another assignment, and I have to do even better on that one. So no matter what, that's the illusion of perfection. Like you think you've got it, and there's this sense of relief, a sense of confidence that comes, but inevitably, because this is how life is, there's going to be another task. There's going to be something else on your to-do list that you also feel has to be done in a completely perfect manner. And then the stress and the dread start all over again.
Yeah.
That was great that I accomplished that, but now it's on to the next thing. And that's got to be even better so I can continue to prove myself. And the parallel with OCD is that people experience these obsessions, unwanted thoughts and images and feelings. They engage in a compulsion to get a sense of relief. And compulsions can provide that feeling. They can, right? The obsession goes away for a little bit. Anxiety goes down for a little bit. But the trap is that it's temporary. The obsession's going to, right? Yep. The obsession's going to come back. The discomfort with it's going to come back. And it's way too tempting to give into the compulsion again. So when we're working with people with OCD, we have to let them know compulsions don't work. Yeah. They really don't work. Yep. If you get any relief, it's temporary. Same thing with perfectionism. The way in which you're striving to hit these unattainable goals is not working, because no matter what, there's going to be something else on the horizon that you think you have to do better.
And you just stay in that trap. And anybody who has OCD knows that was a perfect parallel example, because the compulsions, and the funny thing too is that the compulsions, I remember at the start of my journey with OCD, it was like a compulsion could give me, maybe right at the start, it could probably give me a couple days of relief. Maybe even a week if I was lucky. But that time just shrank and shrank and shrank and became less. And before you know it, a compulsion gave me relief for 10 seconds. And I was right back into, ruminating and struggling with the intrusive thoughts. And so I could see this so much with just that trap of perfectionism. So what are some of the common patterns of perfectionism that individuals might experience?
So I hope this ends up answering the question. I say, really look at the process you're engaged in to try and achieve some outcome, right? Okay. So if the goal, if the expectation is I have to be the top performer in my current job, look at what you're going through to try and achieve that, right? Are you dreading going to work day in and day out, right? Do you not want to take part in the next meeting? Are you really hoping that like your boss or supervisor doesn't ask you another question? As you're working on whatever project is in front of you, are you feeling distracted, frazzled? Can you feel physical tension and stress? Is there worry? Is there like palpable anxiety going along with it? It's all driven by fear that you may not achieve that outcome, right? For people who are kind of, able to achieve excellence and have a certain level of personal and professional success in their lives that are not perfectionists, they will describe that whole process entirely differently. They're excited about the goal. And from the first moment they've set that goal for themselves, they're able to recognize, hey, this is a goal. It's just that. I hope I can hit it, but it's not the expectation. It's not a mandate that I have to achieve this. And guess what? As I'm working to that goal that I've set for myself, that I've already kind of accepted I may or may not hit, like I'm feeling like energized by this process. This is exciting work I get to do. I can't wait to learn more because this is fulfilling. This is rewarding, right?
Yeah.
It has a whole different emotional feel to it than someone who's striving for a perfectionistic, unattainable outcome.
Wow. I think that is so helpful because, and of course, there is a component of building that awareness, right? Because I do think, and I can even say this for myself as somebody that lives with OCD, I think for the longest time, I got used to living in a state of fear, tension, and that became my baseline. So I almost got lost in the cloud of, I don't know anything else. I don't know what it feels like to feel calm and relaxed and focused in any aspect of my life. Obviously OCD comes with its own set of challenges, but it's so true though. Are you operating from a place of tension and frustration and fear around the next step in the process as you're trying to achieve that goal? I feel that that's very simple and easy to digest, and I think a lot of people can relate to that. So, I guess the next question for me is like, once somebody, because I have written on here, you had talked about toxic perfectionism and the 5 tendencies. How do those tie into what we just talked about now with the habit and sort of the feeling and behaviors that come along with perfectionism? How do those tie in?
Yeah. Great question. And anytime I'm asked to talk about my book and the 5 tendencies, I can never remember all 5 of them. And you know what? That's okay.
I have them written down too. So,
but it's okay if I don't remember it perfectly, right?
Of course. I love that. And that's playing right into it. I actually wrote them down because I wanted to read them out loud anyways.
Yeah.
The need for approval and pleasing others, procrastination, inaction, and paralysis, which you've touched on. Yep. The upside of making mistakes, being highly critical, and then fear of judgment. Those were the 5 that you talked about. So I'm curious about how those play in to that. The habit and the feelings that you start to form as you're going to achieve that goal, where it's not something that's exciting and fulfilling, but instead it sort of feels like a burden and miserable, and you don't like really want to face it head on.
Yeah. So I can touch on all of those. So the first one you mentioned, kind of that need for approval from others. The easiest way to think of that is people pleasing. And that has a really strong negative emotional impact on people. So usually people pleasing arises out of the belief, and again, where this came from, who knows? But people just form these beliefs over the course of their life. People pleasing comes out of the belief that other people's needs are more important than my own. I always have to come off a certain way to other people. So this often ties into what we call emotional perfectionism.
Yes.
It's this really unhealthy belief that people can only see me when I'm in a positive mood. I cannot let other people know that I'm feeling, the littlest bit down.
Yeah.
Sad or stressed or anxious or jealous or angry, whatever it may be. So emotionally, I always have to present myself
Mm.
as happy and competent and confident.
Yes.
And if that's your belief, how you should come across to others all the time in your personal and professional life, that is exhausting. It is exhausting because you're
Yes.
essentially, whatever mood you're actually in, you're not allowing yourself to
To
just
feel.
experience that emotion, right? So
Yes.
the people pleasing involves so much sacrifice. There's the emotional sacrifice, there's the behavioral sacrifice, dropping everything and anything you need to do for yourself to take care of yourself for other people all the time, right? So there's physical exhaustion that goes
Mm.
along with it as well. So that becomes really destructive over time, really interferes with people's abilities to form like truly genuine relationships with other people.
Yeah.
And these are often people who struggle with like really poor self-esteem, a really poor sense of self-worth,
Yeah.
because the only way they know how to gauge themselves and their own sense of worth is if they're getting that approval from others.
Yes.
And if they're not constantly receiving accolades and compliments, they are really quick to kind of judge themselves negatively and literally see themselves as lesser than another person.
I just immediately think to the social media world that we live in now and how, geez, how much that must just be complete and total gasoline on a fire to somebody who struggles with that need for constant validation and approval. And what did you call it? You called it emotional perfectionism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm seeing attributes of that myself because sometimes I feel that in my line of work as an advocate that I need to show up a certain way in the world to create safe space for other people to show up with their pain and their struggle. But I'm an advocate and I'm an author and I've got this podcast and stuff, but I'm a human. I still struggle. So that's really fascinating. That's really fascinating because I don't think I would have connected that dot had you not said that. So I do feel that I mean, I know it for myself. It does. It puts an emotional burden on yourself when you feel that you have to show up a certain way in the world. And I mean, when I was experiencing severe anxiety and depression, I felt that I had to hide it from people back then too. Now, of course, as an advocate years and years later, I don't believe that anymore. If I'm super anxious or depressed, like I don't feel that I need to bury that or hide that. But there's also, I don't want to say smaller emotions, not as intense emotions that we're still allowed to show and exhibit. And for me, it's like I don't have to be happy and bubbly all the time if that's not how I'm feeling.
Right.
And I have to imagine that other people listening to what you just said probably could relate to that. I have to imagine that a lot of people feel like they have to show up in the world in a certain way. So that's interesting.
Yeah,
I appreciate
definitely.
you sharing that.
Yeah, well, and I think it's important, right? Because this is an area where genuinely I want people to know that you're not alone in that, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned social media, that has a huge influence on it. Think about what people actually put out on social media, right? This is the best day ever. Here's this perfect picture of me with my girlfriend or me with my family, and we're having the most perfect meal in the most perfect spot of perfect weather, right? Right?
Yes.
That's all people put out there. That's all we see. And that's not representative of what day-to-day real life is.
Yeah.
Right? There are also kind of messages and influences we get either directly or indirectly as we grow up. It can be from family, it can be from friends, it can be from people like teachers, coaches, bosses, whatever it may be, right? We're often told things that if we buy into it and believe it for life, it's ultimately not helpful, right?
Do you have an example?
I've caught myself doing this as a parent, right? And it didn't fully click till I heard myself saying these things to my own kids.
Yeah.
Things like, oh, don't be sad. You should be fine. You should be happy.
Right.
Right. What am I communicating to my kid? He's upset about something. He's experiencing a very valid emotion at that stage. And I'm telling him he should not feel that way. He should feel something different. That leads to emotional perfectionism.
Wow. Such a good example. And relatable. I'm sure that there are so many people that have heard that and received that messaging at some point in their life from a friend, a parent, a family member, a loved one, whatever, I feel like that's so common. Oh, don't feel sad about that. Like it's not that big of a deal. Even if you say it like that, like, hey, don't be so sad. That's not that big of a deal. Even that, right, could potentially be damaging. That's fascinating. So what about procrastination, inaction, and paralysis? How does that play in?
Yeah, so my best example is my own personal example, right? Yeah. I was so afraid of the process I would get caught up in, and I was actually afraid that I would not achieve a perfect outcome, that it was easier and it felt safer. It was a temporary safety, but it felt safer just to not do something at all.
Yeah.
And sometimes that does lead to full-blown paralysis.
Yes.
Right. So with procrastination and avoidance, I had to convince myself of this, and this is my argument I make to people, right? I take a very behavioral approach in the work I do, meaning let's look at the behaviors you're doing that are perpetuating your own stress and discomfort. See if we can disrupt those behaviors.
Yeah.
And when I bring that argument, if you will, to someone who's reporting a lot of avoidance and procrastination, the most common response is, well, that's not a behavior because I'm not doing anything. My argument is, no, you're actively avoiding something.
And that's a behavior.
Right. You're actively putting something off.
Yeah.
That is actually a behavior. Sometimes inaction itself is actually a behavior. And then if we really think about it, and again, I'm just thinking about myself, if you're procrastinating something or you're avoiding something, it's not like you don't know it's still out there, right? It's like this whole idea, you're like dodging a bullet, but and I hate to use this analogy in this day and age, but there's still a loaded gun out there.
Right.
And it's just going to keep firing bullets, right?
It's like the saying of it's like hanging over your head.
Yeah.
Like in your example, just because you didn't write that midterm paper didn't mean that the midterm paper just vanished into thin air.
Right. Like
it still had to be written.
Exactly. Right. And that's still in the back of my mind. Right.
Yes.
And it comes up in my mind and I'm like, oh, no, I don't want to think about that right now. What else can I do?
Yeah.
So that leads me to something I think is important to talk about. It's another kind of trick or trap of perfectionism. We call it, quote unquote, productive procrastination.
Yes, so I've heard about this.
All right. So it's someone literally fooling themselves that they are being productive and they're still feeling useful and accomplished because they're doing a bunch of stuff, but it's all in an effort to avoid the big thing they don't want to do.
Yeah.
So I know I'm using the same example over and over again, but when I had a big term paper that was due, I was procrastinating it. Guess what? That was the cleanest my apartment ever looked.
Yes.
Hey, today is a great day to get everything organized. Oh man, I've been wanting to put up those new shelves for a while. Let's get those new shelves up. Yeah. Let's get the stuff up on the shelves. It all looks great. Look how productive I was. But it's all BS. Because I'm actually procrastinating the big thing I'm scared to do.
Yes. So it's just bubbling up inside of me, and I just have to ask it, what do we do? What do we do to start to chip away at this? Because I'm thinking about friends in my life. I've learned a lot about myself just even through preparing for this, taking that little quiz, talking to you right now. What do we do? I mean, how do we start to talk about the cognitions, the behavioral approach, all of it? Like I want to understand how does somebody in a simple, practical manner, even I guess, start to chip away at this so that they're not stuck and they don't, whether it's the need for approval or the procrastination and paralysis or the fear of judgment. I mean, how do we start to chip away at this?
Yeah, great question. I think as I talk about this, I also want to make sure I talk about the other one you mentioned, which is the upside of making mistakes.
Yes.
Because that's an area that this all kind of blends together, but that's an area that also contributes to paralysis. People are so afraid of making a mistake, actually getting something wrong, that they just don't allow themselves to do anything that feels the tiniest bit risky.
Mm.
So they stay stuck in that kind of paralyzed state as well.
Okay.
So the point there being, you can't always think your way out of perfectionism.
Okay.
You definitely can't think your way out of OCD. I tell people that all the time.
I know that's I can validate that one, y'all. That is as true as it gets right there.
Right. You cannot think your way out of OCD, and you cannot think your way out of perfectionism.
Okay.
There has got to be a behavioral change.
Mm.
A lot of the behavioral changes people can implement come out of kind of a subset of CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, known as exposure and response prevention, or ERP. ERP is kind of the gold standard treatment for OCD itself. It's the most evidence-based form of treatment for OCD and all forms of anxiety disorders. Mm-hmm. It's also incredibly effective for somebody who has perfectionistic behavioral patterns but doesn't meet criteria for anything.
Wow, I did not know that. Mm-hmm. That is awesome, because I love ERP, because I know it sort of sucks in the moment when you're doing it. It's supposed to, right? Because it's supposed to spike that anxiety, and you're supposed to learn to tolerate that. But geez, is it effective? I mean, sometimes I count my lucky stars that I ended up with OCD, because it's very treatable, and you have the power. Once you learn the skills, you can replicate them. So how would somebody do ERP for perfectionism?
So maybe, a pretty straightforward example will come back to something like fear of making mistakes. Right.
Okay.
And we'll try and use like kind of maybe a social example, because it kind of ties into people pleasing as well. Right. So maybe somebody is afraid to put themselves in a social situation out of fear that they will misspeak. Maybe they'll say something that someone else doesn't agree with.
Okay.
Maybe they'll be trying to talk about, a story they heard or an article they read, and they'll get a detail or a fact of that wrong, right?
Yep.
And their fear of making mistakes is so big that they would actually avoid those social interactions.
Yeah.
Even if it's people they know and they like and they respect and they would like to be with, right?
Yeah.
Maybe they're avoiding that, or maybe they're putting themselves in those situations, but they're remaining incredibly quiet. They don't want to contribute to the conversation out of fear of making a mistake, right? The behavioral component would be anything you're avoiding, make yourself face it.
Yeah.
It's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be awkward. There will likely be anxiety involved. But the more you avoid anything, a situation, a project, whatever it is, the more you avoid things, the bigger your anxiety gets.
Yes.
Avoidance increases anxiety. It really, truly does.
Yes.
So number one step, whatever you're avoiding, stop avoiding it. Easier said than done. With ERP, it's a more gradual process. We would look at like a step-by-step way people could start to gradually decrease their avoidance, right?
Yeah.
So let's say you push yourself through that discomfort of making a mistake in a social situation. The first step is you make yourself go to the social situation.
Yep.
You make yourself speak to people around you. And at some point, you purposely get something wrong. Right?
Yes.
The idea here is that you show yourself you can tolerate discomfort. You can tolerate anxiety.
Yeah.
You can even purposely do something that feels like a mistake or an error, totally flub something up.
Yep.
And you can handle it. 9 times out of 10, what you'll notice is other people don't care. They certainly do not care nearly as much as you care. Yeah. They certainly do not care nearly as much as you fear they will care.
Yeah.
Most of them don't even notice. Or, and again, this is my own experience in working with dozens, hundreds of people over the years, right? They put themselves in a situation, they purposely flub up, and other people laugh. They think it's funny or endearing, right? So there's not this huge negative reaction. There isn't this terrible, horrible outcome. So people are teaching themselves, when I behaviorally do things differently, I learn that I can tolerate any discomfort associated with it. And what I was afraid of happening hardly ever actually happens. My fears do not come true.
They don't come true, right? One thing that comes to mind for me, though, is that let's say that somebody did take offense, right? Because we live in cancel culture world now.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I know I've been reading the articles, and there's some other advocates in the space, specifically with OCD, that have been very outspoken about cancel culture and just the detriment that that's playing on people's mental health and anxiety levels, stress levels, etc. But let's say that somebody did take, you said you misspoke, right? You're in a social setting and you said something that's no longer socially acceptable, but you didn't know and you didn't mean anything by it, and somebody did take offense to it, and you have anxiety and you have emotional perfectionism, and now you're mortified. Is there a self-worth and confidence component that comes in here where, yes, you are exposing yourself to the situation? Let's say that your exposure for that day, because as somebody who knows about the exposure process, let's say that the only thing that you had to do that day was show up to the social gathering and then talk to somebody. And you had anxiety out of your mind. But then at some point, you said the wrong thing. Okay. But it actually did offend somebody. What say you to the component about the self-worth and confidence, and at what point do we also have to factor in that component if, using the social setting and emotional perfectionism, the worst case scenario did happen? It turns out that you said something that somebody didn't like, and now they don't like you.
Yeah.
What do you say to that? I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Because I'm genuinely curious, and I see this with young adults. Like, they are so scared of slipping up and saying the wrong thing that people are, geez, what's the term for it? They're policing their own conversation. They're policing what they say. They're policing their thoughts. They're policing the words that they say and the conversation. And I mean, I think we can all agree that there are things that it would be better if we didn't say, right? But
yes, yeah.
I genuinely believe that the majority of the world is not going out and saying things. There are certainly people that do go out and they are malicious, but I don't think that the majority of us are. So what are your thoughts on that? I'm curious from a clinical perspective.
Yeah. I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think there are a couple important key points to touch on here. First of all, right, this isn't the case for 100% of the people 100% of the time, but more often than not, someone with OCD, someone with or without OCD with perfectionistic people-pleasing tendencies is highly unlikely to actually cross the line and say anything that would be considered offensive or disrespectful.
Right.
So you're talking about this fear people build up, and I understand, especially with cancel culture, right?
Yep.
But my argument would be that fear is still magnified.
Yes.
When something is that important to you, deep down inside, you are not the kind of person that wants to be malicious or disrespectful or rude or anything like that. It is extremely unlikely that you're going to then actually behave in the way you fear.
Right.
Right. Yep. So I'm saying that because a lot of times with OCD and perfectionism, people want a guarantee.
Yes.
I want to guarantee I can go into this conversation, say something that someone may not like, but I'm not going to offend them. I'm not going to be ostracized. I'm not going to be shunned and ridiculed, right? I want that guarantee before I do it.
Right.
If you have that guarantee before you do it, it's not going to be an effective exposure exercise.
Yes.
Because part of doing ERP is doing things that feel risky and uncomfortable, and then later learning they actually weren't as risky as you thought they were. So that's the first thing I'll say.
So there has to be uncertainty.
Second thing I'll say is that when we're doing ERP, and I do think, even if you don't meet diagnostic criteria for anything, if you recognize you have unproductive, unhelpful, perfectionistic patterns, find someone who specializes in ERP to help you with it. Because in working with an ERP therapist, you can design a much more structured way to go about these exposures. So no decent ERP specialist would ever tell someone, hey, go out tonight and start throwing out racial slurs.
Right.
To anyone and everyone you see.
Yeah.
And see what happens. You'll be able to handle it. You can deal with it. Right.
Yes.
We can't in good conscience advise something like that. We would never advise anything like that. It's completely unethical. And ultimately it would be counterproductive. It could lead to decreased self-esteem. even more self-criticism, right?
Yep.
So I think that's an excellent point you brought up. So we would look at it in a very graduated way, right? Can you go to the party and make some small talk about something completely innocent?
Yep.
And next time there's an opportunity, you go, you talk a little bit more. And then before you do that, you and I will decide together what's something you could say that clearly shows you don't know what you're talking about.
Yes.
That simply is not offensive.
Right.
So I live in Chicago. I like the Chicago Bears. If I was going to do an ERP exposure, I would have gone to a gathering Sunday night after the Bears lost to the Cowboys and be like, hey, wasn't that a great game? Bears looked awesome. No, they look terrible. They are terrible, right?
Yeah.
So something like that points out you kind of don't know what you're talking about. But at the end of the day, it's pretty innocent.
Yeah.
Right. And still, that would be important for people to have that experience, see that, again, it's not that likely that people are going to react in a super negative, critical way. And even in the rare cases, and it does happen sometimes, I have to be honest, someone's worst case scenario can come true.
Yeah.
Nobody likes that idea. Nobody likes that prospect. But I can tell you, for people I've worked with over the years, when their fears do actually come true in some way, shape, or form in life, guess what else they learn? They can deal with it.
Yes.
It's not pleasant. Oftentimes it hurts, but ultimately they can deal with it. And I've had people tell me, you know what? I'm stronger for this.
And I like that example too, because I could picture you being at a social gathering and there's like a guy there that you say that to, and he's like a diehard Bears fan, and he's like, this guy has no freaking clue what he's talking about. I don't like this guy. I don't want to talk to this guy anymore.
Right.
And it's like, okay, fine then. I guess you're not in my social circle anymore. Like, but that could be somebody's worst fear coming true, and it's learning how to tolerate that, which is why I was asking about the self-worth and confidence, because at a certain point, getting back to the people pleasing and validation, I have to imagine, and again, I know you can't think your way out of it. It has to be behavioral, but at a certain point, there has to also be the building up of the self-worth and confidence in conjunction with the tolerance that, you know, you could make a social slip up, or maybe you won't get the type of validation, or people won't agree with what you say, right? I mean, there's got to be a component of that too, I would think.
Yeah, I would agree. And, not to harp too much on the behavioral piece, but I'll talk about this a little bit before I talk about more the cognitive, the thinking piece. Showing yourself that you can do things despite feeling anxious and scared about it often naturally increases confidence.
Yes.
Right. So, not that it's all about me, but I'll continue to use personal examples, right? I work with this awesome organization called NoCD. We provide telehealth treatment for people all over the US, Canada, the UK, and Australia for people living with OCD. I have been given amazing opportunities there, right? I have been given roles that at no point did I fully believe I could really do. This most current position I've been fortunate enough to receive. I'm their director of clinical training. I oversee the training for all their therapists in their network. Which currently it's over 300 people.
It's amazing.
When I took it on, I didn't know if I could do it. I was nervous. I was scared. But by simply showing up each day, taking the next step, and seeing what I could figure out and accomplish that day, I have built up my own confidence, right? All the while, just living with some doubt and uncertainty. I'm not sure if I can do this. I'm not sure if I'm, the best person for this position, but let me just try and see how it goes.
Yeah.
And when you try and see how it goes, more often than not, you feel better. Even if you mess stuff up along the way, we learn more from our mistakes than we do from everything we get right in life. Truly. Yeah. That's the other upside to making mistakes. When we get something wrong, we are more likely to remember how we got it wrong, what we got wrong, and we can use that to our benefit moving forward. Right?
Yes.
So that I cannot stress enough, the behavioral piece is so important. When you push yourself through doubt and anxiety and just try things, usually a sense of self-confidence builds out of that. There is the cognitive piece. We can't just let that go unchecked, right?
Yeah.
But I do think it's important, if you're someone living with these perfectionistic beliefs, take some time and think about how you develop those and why they're so important to you, right? You were talking about some of the things you checked yes to on that survey, right?
Yes.
You mentioned what we call should statements.
Yes.
I should be doing more.
Yep.
I should be better.
Yep.
I should always be happy, right?
Yes.
Should statements are awful. Should statements actually erode our sense of self-esteem and sense of self-worth. So if you're someone who's living with a lot of those in your head and you're always telling yourself things should be different, every time you tell yourself you should be different, you're discounting yourself. You're putting yourself down. That's not fair.
Yeah.
Why would you do that to yourself? You don't deserve that.
Yeah.
So that cognitive piece is looking at some of these beliefs, some of these thinking patterns that have developed over time, and seeing if they still make sense to you at this point in your life. Maybe you learned them through adolescence, through young adulthood. Yeah, there are definitely messages in our society that we're like bombarded with all the time.
Yeah.
Make us feel like we should be doing more, we should be different, we should be better. But to like take a moment and think about it. Does that really gel with you and what you value? How important are those beliefs to you? If they no longer line up with what you really think is meaningful and important, try and think about it in a different way.
So another question I have for you is, and I know we're running close on time here, so I want to be respectful. I loved the social example. What if somebody was hung up on, like, let's say that somebody was trying to write a manuscript for a book or something, and they were just stuck on it, and they couldn't do anything to get past it. Like, they would write a sentence and then rewrite it a bunch of different times, and it was like, I just need to write this sentence. I know that there's a better way to write it. How does somebody start to overcome that type of perfectionism? Is it the same thing with ERP, and they just write it however they write it? They get like 3 tries. You can write it, that sentence, 3 times, and on the 3rd time you just have to tolerate however that sentence came out.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are creative ways you can approach it. And again, if you're someone that's that stuck, I really recommend like working with an ERP therapist to help you through that. But that's a great example. You could do just that. I've got 3 tries. I'm going to look at those 3, just pick one and move on to the next thing. Sometimes with ERP, we set time limits, right? We see people struggling with decision-making, rereading, re-editing, rewriting, all those things you described. It can even be sending a text out, right?
Yeah.
Erasing the text, retyping it, erasing it, retyping it, checking it. Does it look right? Is this going to bother somebody? Are they going to understand what I'm saying, right? All that kind of stuff, right? Set a time limit. You've got 12 seconds to type up that text to your friend and hit send without looking at it, right?
Yeah.
You've got 1 minute to write a sentence for your manuscript. When that timer goes off, you move on, right? None of this is easy.
Yeah.
When people really push themselves to do those things, that's where the learning really occurs.
Yeah.
Because I could see, right? I wrote this book on perfectionism. I was stuck many times.
Well, because I saw your example at the start of the book. That's why I wanted to ask it, because I know that there's got to be people that are like that, that feel the same way. Whether it's a group project, a paper they have to write up, a manuscript, a movie script that they're trying to put together, something, and they're just stuck. Yeah.
And at some point, right, there's no set way to go about this. You have to develop the attitude that, okay, I'm just going to move forward and see what happens. I don't know how that sentence looks, right? I've been so in the weeds with this, like this paragraph can make no sense anymore. I don't know. I'm going to keep going.
Yes.
And then maybe at some point, even though this is really vulnerable, I'll let someone else look at it, see what they say.
So you learn to tolerate the uncertainty around the outcome, if you will, and then there's some openness to potentially letting somebody else take a look at it, whatever it might be, and that's how you start to build up that self-worth and confidence, because like you said, through the behaviors as they stack up and you start to build this up as a muscle, perfectionism doesn't have as much control over you because you're willing to tolerate some of that uncertainty. Yeah. I think this is really beneficial for a lot of people, and I've got a bajillion other questions, so I'm gonna have to bring you on for another episode, but I want to be respectful of your time. So the last 2 things I have for you is, where can people find you and how can they connect with you?
Yeah, sure. So I work with NoCD. Their website is treatmyocd.com. I highly recommend checking out their site. They have tons of great information on the nature of OCD, great resources. If you wanted more information on me, that's on their website as well. I also have my own practice here in Chicago. It's called Chicago Counseling Center. And that site is pretty straightforward. It's chicagocounselingcenter.com.
Nice.
Twitter, I'm not super active, but that's at Chicago CD.
Okay.
And then the book, pretty easy to find on Amazon. I am literally the only Taylor Newendorp in the entire world. I learned that this past year.
Wow.
So if you go on Amazon and type in Perfectionism Workbook Newendorp, or even Perfectionism Workbook Taylor, my book will pop up.
Awesome. Yeah. And I will be sure to plug all of that in the show notes as well. So I really appreciate it, Taylor. And then I guess to kind of round things off, what's one piece of advice that you would give somebody to get them started on their mental health journey?
Wow, that is such an amazing question. Right. A lot of what we're talking about involves things that feel like you're taking a chance. I would say take a chance, meaning be open with someone, about what you're experiencing. Many times it's easier to start with a loved one, a trusted friend, that sort of thing. But, don't be afraid to do some research. Look for counselors, look for therapists. There are hundreds of people that understand what you're going through and have specific education and training to help you with it. So help is out there. Reach out for help, even if it feels like you're taking a chance.
I love that. Right in line with the uncertainty, right? Just take a chance, see what happens. Okay. Yep. Well, Taylor, it was great having you on the podcast. I really appreciate you. And yeah, we're definitely going to have to bring you on for additional episodes because I think that people are really going to resonate with your message. And I'm just grateful for your time.
Well, thank you. I would love to come back anytime. Thank you, Zach.
Awesome. Thanks, Taylor.